The sound came before the pain. A flat, cracking noise that didn't belong in a kitchen, followed by a white flash behind my eyes. For half a second, my brain refused to name it. It was just impact. Just force. Then my cheek caught fire, and the room tilted as if the house itself had taken a step back from me. My stepfather didn't raise his voice. He didn't swear. He didn't even look angry. He looked decided. "You're going to Russia," he said, adjusting his cuff like he'd just spilled coffee instead of striking me across the face. "Don't call, don't come back, we're done." I tasted metal. I remember noticing the hum of the refrigerator, the smell of burned toast, the way my mother's hand froze mid-motion over the sink. I remember thinking that if I reacted, if I cried, shouted, begged, this moment would belong to him forever. So I didn't. I looked at him and said very calmly, "Got it." That was when he smiled, not wide, not cruel, just satisfied. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought he'd erased me with one sentence and an open palm. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was the last moment he would ever control the story of my life. I was 56 years old when he slapped me. Old enough to know that violence doesn't start with a hand. It starts with permission. And for years I'd given him plenty of that without realizing it. I had moved back into that house 3 months earlier, telling myself it was temporary. A pause, not a retreat. My divorce had been quiet but expensive, the kind that drains you slowly while everyone pretends to be civil. I'd sold the condo, put most of my things in storage, and accepted my mother's invitation to stay just until you get back on your feet. That phrase should have warned me. I'd spent my adult life standing on my own feet, raising a child, managing a department, paying my bills on time. But exhaustion has a way of softening your instincts. Grief, too. I was tired of being strong. I told myself family meant safety. I forgot who defined safety in that house. My stepfather had married my mother when I was 16. Back then, I'd thought of him as strict but reliable. He paid the mortgage, fixed things that broke, expected obedience the way some men expect weather automatic and unquestioned. Over the years, his authority had grown quieter and heavier. He didn't yell much. He didn't have to. He controlled the rhythm of the house, the money, the decisions that were framed as practical. My mother adapted to him the way people adapt to gravity. She learned when to speak and when not to. She learned to smooth things over, to translate his moods into explanations that made sense to outsiders. He's under a lot of stress. He doesn't mean it that way. You know how he is. I did know how he was. I just didn't realize how much of myself I'd been shrinking to accommodate it. The slap didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing like that ever does. It came at the end of a conversation that had been circling the same drain for weeks about my plans, my finances, my timeline. He asked questions that weren't really questions. How long I planned to stay, whether I'd thought about working abroad, whether I was willing to be flexible. Flexible meant controllable. I knew that. I just hadn't said it out loud. That night, I did something small and unforgivable in his eyes. I set a boundary. I told him I would be moving out within the next month. I told him I didn't need help deciding where or how. I told him calmly that my life was not a project for him to manage. The room went very still after that. He stared at me the way a man stares at a door that refuses to open. And then his hand moved. After he spoke, after I said got it, he walked past me and picked up his briefcase. He had a meeting, he said. As if the morning hadn't just split my life into before and after. The front door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. My mother finally turned around. "Oh my God," she whispered, like this had happened to someone else. She reached for me, then stopped, her hands hovering uselessly in the air. I waited for her to say something decisive, something maternal, something that chose me. Instead, she said, "He didn't mean it like that." I laughed once, a short sound that surprised us both. Then I went upstairs and closed the door to the room I'd been sleeping in, the one that still smelled faintly of dust and old perfume from a life I'd already outgrown. I locked it, even though no one tried to follow me. I sat on the bed and pressed my fingers to my cheek. It was already swelling. I remember thinking how strange it was that my face hurt less than my pride. How strange it was that I wasn't afraid, just alert, like something inside me had snapped into focus. Russia. The word echoed in my head, absurd and theatrical. He'd said it like a threat, but also like a plan. That bothered me more than the violence. Angry men make noise. Strategic men make arrangements. I replayed the last few weeks in my mind, his sudden interest in my documents, the questions about my passport, the way he'd insisted on helping me organize my paperwork. At the time, I dismissed it as his need to feel useful to stay in charge. Now, sitting alone in that room, I felt something colder settle in my stomach. This wasn't an outburst, it was a decision. I opened my laptop and checked my email. Nothing unusual, no missed calls, no warnings. And yet, a sense of inevitability crept over me, heavy and precise. Whatever he'd threatened, he hadn't invented it on the spot. Men like him didn't bluff without a backup plan. Downstairs, I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, cleaning things that were already clean. The familiar sounds of avoidance, plates, water running, the house resetting itself, pretending nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling fan, counting the rotations. I didn't cry. Not yet. Tears felt premature, like a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I made a quiet inventory of what I knew and what I didn't. I knew he wanted me gone, not just out of the house, but out of reach. I knew my mother would not stand between us. I knew I had underestimated the cost of being dependent, even briefly. What I didn't know, what gnawed at me as the morning wore on, was how far he'd already gone. I fell asleep sometime after noon, exhaustion overtaking adrenaline. When I woke up, the house was silent again. My phone lay on the nightstand where I'd left it untouched. No messages, no calls, just a faint buzz as it reconnected to the network like a heartbeat returning. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that Russia had been nothing more than a cruel exaggeration. A line crossed in anger. Something that would cool down, be walked back, apologized for in awkward pieces. Then I heard the sound of paper sliding across the kitchen table. I didn't know it yet, but within 48 hours, my life would be redirected on paper in ink with signatures I had never written. The slap was just the announcement. The real erasure was about to begin. I woke up with my jaw clenched so tight it ached. For a moment, I didn't know why my face felt wrong, why the air in the room felt heavy. Then I turned my head, caught my reflection in the mirror across the room, and saw the faint bloom of purple and yellow spreading along my cheekbone. The house was too quiet. Downstairs, I could hear the soft, efficient sounds of morning coffee brewing, a drawer closing, footsteps moving with purpose. The kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from control. He was already dressed when I came into the kitchen. Jacket-pressed shoes, polished tie, nodded with the confidence of a man who believed the worst thing he'd do that day was already behind him. My mother stood at the counter stirring oatmeal she wouldn't eat. Her eyes flicked to my face and away again. "Sit," my stepfather said, nodding toward the table. His voice was neutral, professional, the voice he used with bank managers and contractors, not the voice of a man who'd struck someone the night before. I didn't sit. There was a thick envelope in the center of the table. Not white, cream-colored heavy stock, my name typed neatly across the front. No return address. "What is that?" I asked. He took a sip of his coffee. "Information. I suggest you read it carefully." Then he left the room as if whatever was inside no longer concerned him. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before touching it. It felt heavier than paper should. When I slid a finger under the flap and pulled the contents free, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Ink, toner, something official. The top document was a contract. My name sat at the top in bold letters, followed by a string of numbers I recognized with a jolt: my date of birth, my social security number. Below that, paragraphs of dense language, the kind designed to exhaust you into agreement. I skimmed until one word stopped me cold. Assignment. I flipped to the next page, then the next. A visa application, a work placement confirmation, authorization forms granting permission to manage travel housing compensation, my compensation. My hands started to shake, not from fear, but from disbelief. These weren't drafts. These weren't proposals. They were finalized, stamped, approved, and there on the last page was my signature, or something that looked like it. I laughed out loud, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, even though no one was there to hear it. I followed him into the living room, papers clutched in my hand like evidence. He stood by the window checking his phone. "This is fraud," I said. "I didn't sign any of this." He didn't turn around. "You agreed?" "No," I said louder now. "I absolutely did not." He finally faced me, eyebrows raised in mild concern. "We discussed options. You said you were open to a change. You said you trusted me to help." "I said nothing even close to this," I snapped, waving the documents. "You forged my name." He sighed, the long-suffering sound of a man burdened by someone else's irrationality. "You were emotional. You don't remember everything clearly." "That's understandable. Gaslighting has a particular texture. It doesn't hit you all at once. It seeps in, asking you to doubt your footing, your memory, your sanity." I turned to my mother. "Did you know about this?" She pressed her lips together. "He mentioned it. Mentioned what?" "That you might be going overseas for a while. For work. For work I never applied for." She shrugged, helpless. "He said it would be good for you, a fresh start, and you believed him." My voice cracked then just a little. "You didn't think to ask me." She finally looked at me, eyes shining with something that might have been regret. "I thought you two talked." There it was, the careful phrasing, the escape hatch. She hadn't lied. She'd simply chosen not to verify. "I signed as a witness," she added quietly. "He said it was just procedural." Something inside me went very still. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. This is already in motion. Fighting it will only make things worse. Worse than what I demanded. Worse than leaving quietly," he said. "There are loans tied to your name, accounts you don't know about. If this becomes a legal dispute, questions will be asked. Investigations opened." My stomach dropped. "What loans?" He gave me a look that was almost kind. "Exactly." I thought back over the past year, the mail he'd insisted on sorting, the times he'd offered to handle things for me while I was overwhelmed, the moments I'd been grateful to let someone else take charge. I had handed him the keys. "You can't do this," I said, but the certainty was draining out of my voice now. "I already have," he replied. "The choice you have left is how difficult you want to make it." I retreated to my room and closed the door, hands numb as I began to pack. My suitcase was already under the bed as if it had been waiting. Clothes disappeared into it without thought. This wasn't packing. It was dismantling. Halfway through, I noticed something strange. A stack of boxes in the corner, neatly taped and labeled. My name written in his handwriting, items I hadn't touched yet, items he'd already decided I wouldn't need. On my desk lay a printed receipt. A plane ticket confirmation. Departure in less than 2 days. My heart started pounding then hard enough to hurt. I sat on the edge of the bed and forced myself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help me. Emotion was a liability here. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was executing a plan. That night we ate dinner together like a normal family. He asked my mother about her doctor's appointment. She asked him about his meetings. No one mentioned Russia. No one mentioned my face. I realized then that this was how erasure worked. Quietly, with paperwork and politeness and plausible explanations. Later alone again, I reread the documents more carefully. Dates jumped out at me, signatures, processing times. The earliest form had been submitted weeks before he ever raised his hand to me. The slap hadn't been the beginning, it had been the confirmation. By morning, my options had narrowed to something resembling a corridor, straight ahead or crushed against the walls. If I stayed and fought, I would be fighting on his terrain with his resources under his rules. If I left, I would at least be alive to learn the game he was playing. At dawn, my mother knocked softly on my door. She didn't come in. "I'm sorry," she said through the wood. "He says this will pass, that you can come back once things settle." I closed my eyes. When I rolled my suitcase down the driveway later that day, he didn't hug me. He didn't touch me at all. He stood on the porch watching hands in his pockets like a man seeing off a delivery. At the airport, my mother cried. She told me she loved me. She told me to be strong. He didn't come inside. As I walked toward security phone buzzing with notifications, I didn't have time to read. One thought settled into my bones with frightening clarity. This wasn't punishment. It was removal. And once I understood that, I knew one thing for certain. If I survived what he'd sent me into, I would never let anyone write my life in ink again. The countdown began the moment we left the airport parking lot. He didn't say it out loud, but I could feel it in the way everything moved too smoothly afterward. Appointments appeared on the calendar I didn't remember accepting. Emails arrived confirming things I hadn't requested. My phone buzzed with reminders written in a tone that assumed cooperation. It was as if my life had slipped onto a conveyor belt, and every attempt to step off only pushed me forward faster. My stepfather drove. My mother sat in the passenger seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. No one spoke. The radio stayed off. Silence filled the car like a held breath. The first stop wasn't immigration. That would have been too obvious. It was an office park on the edge of town, low buildings with tinted windows and flags out front. Inside, the air smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee. A woman at the front desk smiled at him, then glanced at me with polite indifference. "She's here," he said. "Not my name, just that." I was handed a clipboard. Forms already filled out, boxes already checked. All I had to do was sign where the yellow tabs pointed. When I hesitated, the woman looked to him, not to me. "She just needs a moment," he said calmly. "She's been under a lot of stress." I felt myself shrinking, not physically, but legally. I was present, but I wasn't the one being addressed. When I asked a question, the answers came to him. When I spoke, my voice landed in empty space. At one point, a clerk flipped through my file and said, "We already have your consent on record." I swallowed. "You do?" She nodded. "Yes, ma'am, dated last month." I turned to him. He met my eyes without flinching. Outside, I tried once more. I stepped away from them, dialed a number I hadn't used in years. A former colleague, someone who knew me as competent, reliable, in control. Straight to voicemail. I called a legal hotline I'd once bookmarked, my hands trembling now, despite my effort to stay calm. After 15 minutes on hold, a tired voice explained that international employment disputes were outside their scope. "You should consult private counsel," she said gently. I almost laughed. With what money? With what time? By the end of the second day, my resistance felt ceremonial. Every door I reached for closed before my hand touched the knob. The system didn't need to threaten me. It simply refused to acknowledge me as a decision-maker. On the morning of departure, my phone lost service halfway to the airport. No warning, no explanation. Just a blank screen where my world used to be. My mother kept glancing at me, her mouth opening and closing as if words were trapped behind her teeth. Finally, she said, "He really believes this will help you." I stared out the window. "Belief doesn't make it right." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know." But she did not stop the car. At security, she hugged me tightly, whispering apologies into my hair. Promises that this was temporary, that he'd calm down, that we'd figure it out. I wanted to ask her why figuring it out always meant enduring it first. Instead, I pulled away and handed my boarding pass to the agent. I didn't look back. The flight felt unreal, like a badly dubbed movie. The seats were narrow. The air was dry. People around me chatted about vacations and business trips, their lives moving forward, as if nothing catastrophic had just happened 3 rows over. Somewhere over the ocean, the weight of it settled fully into my chest. Not panic, not fear, a hollow understanding. I was being removed. When we landed, a woman holding a sign with my name stood just beyond customs. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. She gestured for me to follow. We took a smaller plane next, older, louder, the kind that rattles when it hits turbulence, as if reminding you not to get too comfortable. The man beside me glanced at my coat and shook his head with a small, pitying laugh. I didn't ask why. The final drive lasted hours. Snow stretched in every direction, broken only by clusters of dim lights that might have been towns or might have been nothing at all. The heater in the van hummed without producing warmth. My fingers went numb. I stopped trying to feel them. No one spoke. When we arrived, it was dark. A concrete building loomed out of the snow, its windows glowing faintly like tired eyes. Inside, the hallways smelled of disinfectant and damp clothing. A supervisor handed me a key and pointed down a corridor. "4th floor," he said. "No elevator." The room held 6 women and 1 bathroom. Bunk beds lined the walls. A single bulb buzzed overhead. They looked at me with curiosity, then with something closer to sympathy. That night, lying on a narrow mattress under a thin blanket, I stared at the ceiling and listened to unfamiliar breathing around me. I thought of my stepfather's face when he said we were done, the certainty in his voice, the satisfaction. He thought distance would erase me. He thought isolation would break me. What he didn't understand was that being stripped of everything familiar sharpens you. When there's nothing left to lose, you stop wasting energy on denial. I closed my eyes and made a decision, as quietly as everything else had happened to me. I would survive this place. I would learn its rules, its rhythms, its blind spots. I would become someone who could not be moved without consent. And one day, when the paperwork caught up with him, when the silence he'd forced around me collapsed back onto his own life, he would realize something far too late. He hadn't sent me away. He had placed me exactly where I would learn how power really works. No one welcomed me. There was no orientation, no speech about safety or expectations, no friendly lie about opportunity. I was handed a laminated card with a number on it, a thin blanket that smelled like bleach, and a gesture toward a hallway already crowded with people who knew better than to ask questions. My bag was searched, not thoroughly, not carefully, just enough to remind me that nothing I carried truly belonged to me anymore. A supervisor flipped through my passport, checked a list taped to the wall, then slid it into a drawer without comment. When I hesitated, he looked up, irritated. "You get it back later," he said, already turning away. Later turned out to be a concept, not a time. The building was colder inside than out. Concrete walls held the chill like memory, releasing it slowly, deliberately. Somewhere above us, pipes clanged and groaned, the sound echoing down the stairwell as I climbed to the 4th floor. No elevator, just narrow steps worn smooth by decades of boots and resignation. The room I was assigned to held 8 beds, 6 of them occupied. Women of different ages and accents sat or lay, quietly conserving energy. They looked up when I entered, curiosity flickering across their faces, before settling into something more practiced. Assessment. One of them pointed to an empty bunk with her chin. That was it. No names exchanged, no questions asked. I dropped my bag and sat my body, finally acknowledging how exhausted it was. A bell rang before dawn. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The sound carried authority. We dressed quickly, pulling on layers of clothing that never quite felt thick enough. Someone handed me gloves that were too big, then laughed softly when I struggled to pull them on. "You learn," she said, not unkindly. Outside, the air burned. It didn't sting. It consumed. My lungs protested with every breath, the cold sliding in sharp and unforgiving. The walk to the worksite was silent, except for the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional cough that broke the rhythm. Inside the facility, the noise took over. Machines hummed, belts clattered, metal struck metal in a relentless cadence. The smell hit next, heavy and invasive, a mix of chemicals and something organic I couldn't immediately identify. It clung to my clothes, my hair, the back of my throat. No one explained the job. I watched the woman beside me and copied her movements. Lift, sort, pass along, over and over. When I hesitated, a supervisor barked a word I didn't understand. His tone did the work of translation. Faster. My fingers went numb within minutes. By the end of the first hour, they burned. By the third, I couldn't tell which sensation was worse. Time dissolved into a series of tasks measured only by pain and repetition. Breaks came when someone decided they did. Not before. I learned the rules the way animals learn fire, by getting burned. When I reached for water without permission, I was pulled aside and shouted at in a language I barely understood. When I slowed down to adjust my glove, a clipboard smacked the table inches from my hand. No words, just warning. Compliance was not requested, it was expected. During a brief pause, I noticed a list posted near the exit, names written in marker dates beside them. Some crossed out, others circled. I asked the woman next to me what it meant. She shook her head quickly and turned away. That night back in the room, my body shook uncontrollably as it warmed. My hands were swollen skin cracked and red. Someone passed me a jar of thick cream without comment. I mouthed, "Thank you." She nodded once. Across from me sat an older woman with steel gray hair pulled tightly back. She had been watching me all day, I realized, not with curiosity, with calculation. When our eyes met, she looked away as if I'd failed some silent test. I slept hard, then woke just as hard, the bell dragging me back to consciousness. Day 2 was worse, not because the work was harder, but because my body now understood what was coming. Halfway through the shift, I made a mistake. I set an item in the wrong bin, barely noticeable, but enough. The supervisor noticed. He grabbed my arm, not violently but firmly, and shoved me aside. He spoke rapidly, his face inches from mine. I nodded, eyes down, absorbing the lesson. Attention was dangerous. Later, during a moment when no one seemed to be watching, the older woman stepped closer to me. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my hands. "Plastic," she said, slipping a thin bag toward me. "Under gloves." I followed her advice. The difference was immediate. Less sting, less cracking. It wasn't kindness, it was efficiency. Still, it felt like mercy. That night she finally spoke my name, pronouncing it carefully as if testing its weight. "You won't last if you fight," she said quietly, "and you won't last if you trust." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but she was already lying down her back to me. Lesson delivered. Interpretation left to the student. Over the next days, I watched more than I worked. I learned which supervisors enforced rules strictly and which could be distracted. I learned which workers had been there long enough to bend without breaking. I learned the language of glances, the meaning of a pause, the importance of never appearing eager or resistant. At night, stories leaked out of people when exhaustion stripped away caution. A woman from 2 rooms over had been promised something different. A younger girl had followed a boyfriend who disappeared the moment they arrived. An older man had lost his documents and then his options. Patterns emerged. This place didn't destroy people, it sorted them. Those who broke were removed quietly, reassigned, sent somewhere else. No one asked where. Asking was its own kind of mistake. One evening, as we ate thin soup and bread that tasted faintly of dust, someone started crying softly, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be heard. No one moved to comfort her. Compassion, I realized, carried its own risks. Attachment made you visible. The older woman watched me again, her gaze sharp. "You're still looking for fairness," she said. "Stop." That night, lying in the dark, I stopped waiting for rescue. I stopped imagining explanations that would make this make sense. Instead, I began to observe with intention: schedules, shift changes, who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, where the rules softened and where they hardened. By the end of the week, my body hurt less, not because the work was easier, but because I had learned how to move within it. My hands were rough, my muscles aching, but something inside me had settled. I was no longer reacting. On the 7th day, the older woman finally sat beside me and spoke as if continuing a conversation we'd been having all along. "Endurance isn't enough," she said. "Everyone here endures. You need to understand. Understand what I asked." She met my eyes for the first time. "Who benefits when you don't?" Then she stood and walked away. I lay back on my bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words. I thought of my stepfather's calm voice, his certainty, the way systems had responded to him without question. I thought of how quickly authority shifted when paperwork aligned. This place was brutal, yes, but it was also honest in a way my old life hadn't been. Power here didn't pretend to be kind. It didn't hide behind family or obligation. It simply was. And if I wanted to leave, if I wanted to reclaim anything that had been taken from me, I would need more than strength. I would need knowledge, patience, invisibility. As I drifted into sleep, one truth settled deep and steady in my chest. This place would not break me, but it would finish teaching me what I needed to know. The pain didn't disappear. It reorganized itself. One morning, about 2 weeks in, I realized I could make a full shift without counting the minutes. My hands still throbbed, my shoulders burned, but the work no longer surprised me. My body had learned the rhythm before my mind gave it permission. Lift, sort, pass, turn, breathe shallow. Don't rush. Don't lag. Adaptation is not courage, it's arithmetic. That day I finished my section early, not dramatically, just a few minutes ahead of schedule. I felt a flicker of satisfaction before I remembered the older woman's warning. I slowed down, let the last crate linger. When I glanced up, I saw a supervisor watching me from across the floor, his expression unreadable. I learned then that excellence was dangerous. Efficiency invited questions. From that point on, I began to watch everything, not with fear, with curiosity. There was a hierarchy here, and it wasn't the one printed on the walls. Supervisors barked orders, but they deferred to certain long-term workers without acknowledging it. New arrivals were watched closely, not for mistakes, but for reactions. Anger was noted. Tears were remembered. Silence was tolerated. Cruelty wasn't random. It was selective. At night, the older woman, her name was Alina, corrected me without ceremony. She showed me how to stand so my back wouldn't give out before winter ended, how to wrap my hands so the skin wouldn't split open by midweek, how to keep my eyes low without looking submissive. Blend, she said. Don't disappear. Don't shine. She never asked me questions about my life. She didn't need to. Curiosity was a luxury reserved for people with leverage. A few days later, a man started talking to me during breaks. He was older than me, but lively confident. He spoke enough English to make conversation feel easy, like a relief valve after long hours of silence. He told me he knew ways to get better assignments, warmer rooms, extra food. He laughed at the supervisors when they weren't listening. Hope is persuasive when it's wearing a friendly face. Alina watched us from across the room, her mouth set in a thin line. When I met her eyes, she shook her head once. Not urgently, not dramatically. Just a warning. I ignored it. Not completely, but enough. I told myself I was being careful. I shared nothing important. I listened more than I spoke. When he asked questions, I answered around them. When he offered help, I accepted small things, an extra glove. A tip about timing. I wanted to believe kindness could still exist here without a price. I was wrong. The exchange came quickly and quietly. One afternoon, a supervisor called my number and accused me of violating a procedure I hadn't even known existed. The man stood nearby, his face blank. He didn't defend me. He didn't meet my eyes. I was reassigned to a colder section. No explanation, no appeal. Humiliation burned hotter than the air. People watched, then looked away, relieved it wasn't them. I kept my face still, my voice neutral. Inside, something hardened. That night, Alina sat beside me and said nothing for a long time. "You wanted proof," she finally said. "Now you have it." I waited for her to comfort me. She didn't. "Kindness here is rarely free," she continued. "When someone offers it, ask yourself what they need you to stop noticing." I nodded. The lesson settled without drama. From then on, I stopped trading in hope. I traded in silence. I began to notice how information moved. Who knew schedules before they were posted? Who avoided certain supervisors? Who lingered near the exits at shift changes? I memorized patterns without writing anything down, names, habits, small inconsistencies. My old life had trained me for this more than I'd realized. Years of managing people, balancing budgets, spotting errors before they turned into crises. I'd been good at that work. I'd just forgotten it mattered. Memory became my weapon. I stopped reacting when things went wrong. I observed instead. When someone cut in line for supplies, I noted who allowed it. When a supervisor ignored a violation, I noted the context. Nothing happened in isolation here. Everything was connected to something else. The man who'd betrayed me tried to speak to me again. I nodded politely and moved away. He didn't push. Predators don't chase prey that stops bleeding. Weeks passed. My body changed. My hands grew calloused, my movements economical. I learned to wash quickly, eat quickly, sleep deeply. Survival became routine, and routine freed up mental space. One evening after a particularly long shift, I realized something startling. I wasn't angry, not numb, not resigned, calm. Anger requires energy. It also announces itself. Calm, I learned, could be invisible. Alina noticed the change before I named it. She watched me work, then gave a small nod. Approval or maybe acknowledgement? "You're learning," she said. "Now stop letting them see it." I did. I made myself smaller, slower, less interesting. I avoided conversations that went nowhere. I answered questions briefly. I let others take credit for ideas that improved the workflow. And then quietly, I tested something. I withheld a piece of information. Not important, just a timing detail. The result was immediate and instructive. A supervisor missed a target. Tension rippled outward. I remained unnoticed. Power, I realized, didn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrived as absence. That night, lying on my bunk, I made a private promise. I would never again reveal the full measure of my capability to people who benefited from underestimating me. Not here, not anywhere. I thought of my stepfather then. His calm voice, his confidence in systems, his belief that paperwork could erase a person. He'd mistaken compliance for weakness and silence for surrender. He had taught me more than he intended. The woman I'd been before, tired, accommodating, eager to keep peace, felt distant now. Not gone. Integrated. I understood her better. Understood why she'd chosen comfort over confrontation for so long. But comfort was a currency I no longer trusted. As sleep took me, I didn't dream of escape. I dreamed of patterns, of maps, of leverage points that didn't yet have names. I wasn't trying to endure this place anymore. I was studying it. The offer came the same way all traps do. Quietly, reasonably, with just enough detail to feel real. He caught me during a break leaning against the wall as if we'd simply run out of space to stand apart. His voice was low, friendly, almost conspiratorial. He said there was a temporary assignment opening up, lighter work, better hours, a chance to move indoors more often. He said he could put my name forward if I wanted. I didn't answer right away. I had learned that hesitation invited more information. "You've been doing well," he added. "People notice." That should have been my warning. But part of me, the part that still remembered comfort, wanted to believe there was a way out that didn't involve waiting forever. I told myself I would be careful. He explained what he needed in return. Not money, not anything obvious, just details. Who worked which shifts, when certain supervisors rotated out. Small things, harmless things, information I already had. I measured what I shared. I gave him fragments, not the whole picture. I believed I was managing the exchange, controlling the flow. I believed that restraint equaled safety. It didn't. The consequences arrived 2 days later without drama. A supervisor called my number during the morning shift. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He handed me a slip of paper and pointed toward a different section of the facility. Colder, louder, further from the exits. The man stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. When our eyes met, his slid away. He had already collected his reward. I felt the humiliation register in my body before my mind caught up. Heat flushed my face despite the cold. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with recognition. This was what it felt like to be used efficiently. People looked at me, then looked away. No one intervened. No one asked questions. The system absorbed the moment and moved on. I worked the rest of the shift without speaking. Alina didn't come near me that day. That absence hurt more than the reassignment. I had mistaken her warnings for protection. I understood now that she had been allowing me to learn the hard way. That night, she finally sat beside me on the bunk. The room was quiet, heavy with the sound of exhausted breathing. "You crossed a line," she said, not unkindly. "I know. You thought cooperation would save you. I thought control would." She nodded. "There is a difference." I waited for anger to come. It didn't. What rose instead was clarity, sharp and unsentimental. "Kindness is expensive here," she continued. "Anyone offering it wants you to stop seeing something." "What did I stop seeing?" I asked. "That he needed you to believe the offer," she said. "Not that it was real." The truth settled with uncomfortable ease. I replayed the conversation in my head, the careful phrasing, the absence of specifics. I had been so focused on limiting what I gave that I hadn't questioned why he needed anything from me at all. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't collapse. I didn't spiral. I didn't waste energy on self-blame. I dissected the mistake with the same precision I used on everything else now. I had revealed need. Need was leverage. Alina watched me carefully. "Most people break after that," she said. "You didn't." "I don't plan to," I replied. She studied my face, then gave a small approving nod. "Good. Then listen." She told me about asymmetric power, about how systems like this survived not on strength but on predictability. They relied on people reacting the same way every time. Fear, gratitude, anger, hope. "You don't win by fighting the system," she said. "You win by making it miscalculate." That night I lay awake and replayed everything that had happened since I arrived. The slap, the documents, the quiet machinery that had moved me across borders without my consent. The pattern was suddenly obvious. I had been emotional currency, used to solve problems, absorb risk, disappear quietly. And I had been chosen because I was expected to respond like someone who needed approval. I didn't anymore. The next morning, I stopped recording details passively. I began to analyze them. I noticed which supervisors were careless with paperwork, which ones relied on others to cover their mistakes. I noticed discrepancies in hours logged versus hours worked, supplies that went missing, names that appeared on lists without ever appearing on the floor. Someone higher up was stealing, not out of desperation, out of habit. I adjusted my behavior immediately. I became unremarkable. I made mistakes small enough to seem genuine. I followed instructions without enthusiasm. I stopped offering solutions. Invisibility became my shield. I set new rules for myself. I would not share personal information. I would not accept favors without understanding their cost. I would not trade data for promises. I would never again mistake proximity for trust. Within a week, the man who had betrayed me stopped trying to speak to me. I had become uninteresting, unprofitable. That was fine. I tested my understanding with something small, a timing adjustment. I delayed passing along a non-essential update by a few minutes. The result rippled outward in exactly the way I'd predicted. A supervisor snapped at the wrong person. A minor error went uncorrected. No one traced it back to me. I felt something new then, not triumph, control. It was quiet, almost gentle. I thought of my stepfather often during those days, of how confident he'd been in his ability to direct outcomes, of how he'd trusted systems he didn't understand to do his work for him. He had never questioned who truly benefited. I understood now why he'd chosen exile over confrontation, why paperwork had been his weapon of choice. He believed that distance weakened people, that isolation erased resistance. What he'd given me instead was education. By the end of the month, I no longer thought about escape, not because I had abandoned the idea, but because I understood timing. Leaving without leverage was just another kind of disappearance. Alina noticed my restraint. One evening, she handed me a cup of tea, rare and precious. She didn't smile. "You won't be cornered again," she said. It wasn't a question. I took the cup and met her eyes. "No." She nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Then remember this." She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "When people believe they've broken you, they stop watching. That's when you learn everything." That night, as I lay on my bunk, listening to the buildings settle around us, I made another decision, quieter than the first, more dangerous. I didn't need to escape yet. I needed leverage. And for the first time since the slap, since the envelope, since the moment my life had been rerouted without consent, I felt something close to peace. Not because I was safe, because I was no longer predictable. The pattern revealed itself slowly, the way truth usually does when no one is trying to impress you with it. I noticed it first in the language. The supervisors here used the same phrases my stepfather had used back home. Not the words exactly, but the shape of them. Procedure. For your own good. This is how it has to be. Sentences designed to sound inevitable, not negotiable. Sentences that made resistance feel childish. Power loves repetition. It uses familiar scripts because they work. Once I saw that I couldn't unsee it. The way authority leaned on silence instead of explanation. The way questions were treated as inconvenience, not curiosity. The way people were encouraged to feel grateful for scraps of mercy instead of angry about stolen rights. I had lived inside this system before. It had just worn a different accent. One afternoon during a routine inventory check, I heard a name that didn't belong there. It wasn't spoken loudly, just mentioned in passing by a supervisor who didn't realize I was listening. A company name, an American one, logistics, imports, cross-border partnerships. The word landed in my chest like a dropped plate. That night, I replayed it over and over, testing it against what I knew. My stepfather's business had always hovered at the edge of international deals. He talked about them like trophies he hadn't quite earned yet. He'd complained about failed connections, bad partners, misunderstandings. What if sending me here hadn't just removed a problem? What if it had created value? I began following the money the only way I could, indirectly. I watched which shipments were delayed and which sailed through without inspection. I watched which supervisors became nervous when certain trucks arrived. I listened to complaints that weren't meant for me about budgets that never quite balanced and equipment that was always lost. Exploitation wasn't chaos. It was a business model, and I fit into it perfectly. Older, foreign, legally isolated, unlikely to fight back loudly. Exactly the kind of person systems use to absorb risk and disappear quietly when things go wrong. The realization did not make me angry. It made me precise. I adjusted how I moved through the day. I spoke less. I listened more. I fed harmless truths into conversations and kept the dangerous ones locked behind my teeth. When asked direct questions, I answered honestly but incompletely. When offered small privileges, I accepted them without gratitude. Gratitude, I had learned, made people sloppy. The system tested me almost immediately. A supervisor called me aside and asked if I wanted additional responsibility. Not more pay, just trust. He framed it as an opportunity, a sign that I was being noticed. I smiled politely and declined, said I was still learning, said I didn't want to overstep. His disappointment was brief but telling. He had been looking for ambition, something to leverage. I had given him compliance instead. After that, I felt eyes on me more often. Not hostile, curious. Someone was reporting on behavior measuring reactions, deciding who could be useful. I stayed boring. Information became currency, and I learned how it moved when no one thought to hide it. I learned that silence at the right moment was worth more than a well-timed favor, that withholding was often safer than sharing, that trust here was manufactured through repetition, not earned through honesty. And then without ceremony, the truth about my stepfather settled into place. He wasn't the architect of my exile. He was a consumer of a system he admired but didn't control. He'd copied a method he'd seen work for other men: distance as discipline, paperwork as punishment, removal as resolution. He thought he was powerful because the machine had responded to him. He never questioned who built it. Once I accepted that the anger I'd been carrying finally burned itself out, not because he didn't deserve it, but because anger required him to still matter in a way he no longer did. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about timing. I stopped thinking about escape as a rescue. I thought about it as a transaction. Leaving would only be useful when I had something to trade: evidence, knowledge, leverage that traveled. I kept my head down and my mind sharp. I memorized names and routines. I learned which rules bent under pressure and which snapped cleanly. I learned where fear lived and where greed hid behind efficiency. At night, lying on my bunk, I mapped it all out in my head. Not revenge, not yet, just understanding. Alina watched me with quiet approval. She didn't say much anymore. She didn't need to. When she did speak, it was brief and surgical. "You see it now," she said once. "Yes. Good. Don't rush." I didn't. I let time do its work. I let others underestimate me. I let the system believe I had accepted my place inside it. What it didn't realize was that machines rely on patterns, and patterns can be disrupted once you understand where the gears meet. One evening, as snow piled against the windows and the building groaned under its weight, I felt something shift inside me. A long game forming, not fueled by rage but by clarity. If I could identify exactly who benefited most from my exile, I could decide who would eventually pay for it. And for the first time since I'd arrived, the thought didn't frighten me. It steadied me. Because now, finally, I understood how men like him really operated, and more importantly, how they fell. The first crack appeared in a place no one bothered to guard. It was a clipboard left unattended on a metal table near the loading bay pages, curling at the edges from humidity and cold. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I only needed to see the heading and the numbers beneath it. Hours logged, names attached, totals that didn't align with reality. I kept walking. That was the trick I had learned here. You never stopped at the evidence. You let it come to you twice. Over the next 2 weeks, the same discrepancies surfaced again and again. Different days, different supervisors, same pattern. 10-hour shifts recorded for 12 hours of labor. Safety deductions charged for equipment we never received. Overtime promised verbally and erased on paper. Someone was skimming small amounts from everyone, trusting that exhaustion would keep us from comparing notes. They were right. Except about me. I didn't document anything yet. Writing things down created risk. Instead, I memorized numbers, dates, the order in which names appeared. I used the same mental discipline I'd once applied to budgets and schedules back home. My mind became a ledger no one could confiscate. The opportunity to confirm my suspicion came on a night when the supervisors drank too much. There was a celebration of sorts marking a production milestone no one believed in, but everyone pretended to care about. Music played too loudly from a tinny speaker. Plastic cups appeared. Rules softened just enough to expose their seams. I stayed on the edge of the room, quiet, invisible, refilling water when asked. That was when I heard it. 2 supervisors arguing in low voices near the door. Accusations, complaints about Moscow audits, about missing funds that someone would have to explain eventually. One name surfaced repeatedly, not shouted, not whispered, spoken with irritation. The manager. The realization slid into place with surprising calm. This wasn't just exploitation, it was fraud, sloppy habitual fraud hidden behind complexity and distance. That night, lying on my bunk, I didn't feel fear. I felt focus. I began planning without rushing. I needed confirmation from a second source, something independent of gossip and alcohol. That came from a woman in accounting who shared my lunch break twice a week. She was lonely, eager to talk, and unaware of how much she revealed when she complained. Her frustrations spilled out in fragments. Paperwork that didn't add up. Numbers she'd stopped questioning because questioning them only brought trouble. Instructions to correct entries retroactively without explanation. I listened. I nodded. I said nothing. Each conversation filled in another blank. Within a month, the picture was complete. The manager was siphoning money upward and sideways, stealing from both workers and owners. He relied on fear below him and distance above him. Classic. Effective. Until it wasn't. I needed leverage that traveled beyond this building. I began to test boundaries carefully. I asked for clarification on a harmless discrepancy, framing it as confusion rather than challenge. The response was immediate and instructive. I was told not to worry about it, to trust the process. Trust, I thought, was what people demanded when they had something to hide. I adjusted again. I made myself smaller, less curious, less competent. I let others answer questions I knew the answers to. I stopped correcting mistakes that didn't affect my section, and then quietly I prepared. I started memorizing serial numbers on equipment that appeared on inventory lists but never on the floor. I noted which shipments arrived sealed and which arrived tampered with. I learned which nights the manager stayed late and which nights he left early. The risk wasn't being caught. The risk was acting too soon. Alina noticed my restraint. One evening she sat beside me and spoke without looking at me. "You found something," she said. "Yes." "Enough to matter." "Yes." She nodded once. Then wait. Waiting was the hardest part. Not because I was impatient, but because the injustice continued daily. People around me worked harder than they were paid for, injured themselves quietly, accepted less because demanding more felt impossible. I reminded myself that exposing this too early would only protect the people who knew how to survive exposure. I needed this to reach higher. The break came unexpectedly. An audit notice appeared on the bulletin board one morning. Corporate review, routine, nothing to worry about according to the supervisors. But tension sharpened instantly. Conversations stopped when certain people entered the room. The manager's temper flared over minor issues. Fear, I realized, was finally flowing upward. I didn't create the audit. I didn't need to. Systems like this eventually attract scrutiny. All I needed to do was ensure the right eyes saw the right contradictions. I arranged it carefully. During a shift change, I left a folder slightly out of place in an office no one bothered to lock. Inside were documents the accounting woman had complained about. Copies I had memorized but never touched until now. I didn't sign anything. I didn't highlight anything. I let the paperwork speak. 2 days later, the manager was called away mid-shift. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. Supervisors scrambled. Instructions contradicted each other. Fear spread sideways. We worked through it without comment. By the end of the week, rumors circulated. Investigations, missing funds, questions from Moscow that no one here could answer convincingly. The building felt different, quieter, less certain. Alina looked at me across the room and gave the faintest smile. "You're dangerous now," she said softly. "No," I replied. "I'm prepared." The consequences arrived quickly after that. The manager was removed. Not arrested, not punished publicly, reassigned according to the official notice. That was enough. The message traveled. I was approached discreetly by someone higher up, not directly, through intermediaries, questions framed as curiosity, compliments disguised as observations. They wanted to know what I had seen, what I understood. I gave them nothing they could trace back to me. I let them assume they had discovered everything on their own. A week later, I was offered a transfer. Better conditions, different city, more oversight, a chance to be useful elsewhere. I considered it carefully, not because I wanted it, but because it told me something important. They didn't see me as disposable anymore. They saw me as someone who knew how systems failed. That night I lay awake listening to the wind claw at the building and felt something unfamiliar settle into my bones. Leverage. Not the kind that comes from force or threat. The kind that comes from understanding exactly where the weak points are and choosing when to apply pressure. My stepfather had believed power meant control. He had believed distance solved problems. What I was learning was more dangerous. Power meant patience. And I was done being rushed. The transfer felt like a promotion wrapped in exile. No one used that word, of course. They never did. It was framed as opportunity, broader exposure, better conditions, a chance to apply my experience somewhere it could be more useful. The paperwork was clean, efficient, stamped with authority that did not invite discussion. I accepted without hesitation. Saying yes was the safest answer. Curiosity would have been suspicious. Gratitude would have been embarrassing. The new city was bigger, louder, warmer in a way that felt almost obscene after months of cold that gnawed at bone. The facility itself was newer painted recently enough to smell like chemicals instead of despair. The workers walked faster. The supervisors smiled more. Everything looked better on the surface. That was how I knew the problems would be buried deeper. I was assigned to administrative support. Not officially. On paper, I was still labor. In practice, I floated, helping where needed, translating, explaining procedures to new arrivals, fixing small issues that no one wanted to escalate. It was a perfect position. I listened more than I spoke. I learned who talked too much and who never spoke at all. I learned which numbers were sacred and which could be adjusted with the right phrasing. I learned how blame moved when things went wrong. Most importantly, I learned how information traveled upward. The first week, I said nothing. The second, I began asking questions framed as confusion. The third, I stopped asking questions and started predicting answers. Patterns emerged quickly. Money moved in familiar ways. Labor was undervalued strategically, not accidentally. Contracts were structured to look fair while bleeding people slowly. This wasn't survival work. This was enterprise. One evening, while sorting documents no one thought mattered, I saw a familiar logo, an American company name buried in a chain of subsidiaries and shell arrangements. I stared at it longer than necessary, my pulse steady, my mind racing. I knew that logo. I had seen it on my stepfather's desk, on brochures, on emails he thought I hadn't noticed, a potential partner he'd complained about years ago. Deals that never quite closed, promises that always fell through. My exile wasn't just punishment, it was infrastructure. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt obvious the way truth often does once you're finally standing in the right place to see it. He hadn't sent me here to disappear. He'd sent me here because this system already existed, and he trusted it to erase problems quietly. I had been collateral, convenient, replaceable, and now inconveniently informed. I didn't react. Reaction would have exposed me. Instead, I leaned into my role. I became helpful, reliable, invisible. I fixed errors without calling attention to them. I translated documents without comment. I stayed late when asked, never longer. People stopped watching me. That was when I began collecting. Not files, not copies. Knowledge. Connections. Names of people who panicked when certain topics came up. Names of people who spoke too freely after a drink. Names of people who benefited most from complexity. I built a mental map that stretched far beyond this facility, into offices, into companies, into the kind of arrangements men like my stepfather relied on without understanding. One night, I received a message I hadn't expected, an email, plain, polite, from a consulting firm back home. They were following up on an inquiry I didn't remember making. The phrasing was careful, vague enough to be plausible. Someone was looking for me. I didn't reply. 2 days later, another message arrived, this one less careful. My name spelled correctly. A reference to my previous employment. A question about my availability. I forwarded it to a secure folder and did nothing. Information I had learned ripened with time. A week later, the phone calls started. Missed calls from unfamiliar numbers. Messages that assumed urgency without explaining it. My stepfather's style. Direct. Impatient. Used to people responding. I let the phone ring. He didn't know where I was. Not exactly. He knew the country. He knew the general framework. He assumed that was enough. He assumed I was still reacting. He had no idea I was watching. The temptation to confront him rose once, sharp and fleeting. I imagined his voice cracking when he realized how much I understood, how thoroughly his solution had backfired. I let the thought pass. Confrontation was for people who needed closure. I needed positioning. I began reaching out carefully. Old contacts, former colleagues, people who remembered me as competent, reliable, harmless. I framed my messages as updates, casual, curious. The responses told me everything. My stepfather's business was struggling. Again, deals collapsing, partners pulling out, cash flow tightening. He was chasing solutions with increasing desperation. Men like him always did. I had something he needed now. Not money, not forgiveness. Understanding. I waited. The call finally came late one night, the number hidden. I let it ring twice before answering. He didn't speak at first, just breathed, as if confirming I was real. "You're alive," he said finally. "Yes." Silence stretched between us, thick with everything we hadn't said. "I've been trying to reach you," he continued. "We need to talk." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Do we?" "Yes," he said sharply, then softer. "I made a mistake. I let him talk, let him justify, let him frame his actions as necessity, as discipline, as something that had gotten out of hand. I heard the same rationalizations I'd heard from supervisors, managers, men who believed control excused cruelty. When he finished, I spoke. "I know about the partnerships," I said calmly. "The real ones, not the ones you talk about." He froze. I could hear it in the sudden stillness of the line. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the confidence was gone. "I know enough," I replied. "And I know how these systems work now, better than you ever did." He tried to recover to pivot into authority. "You need to come home. This has gone too far." I laughed softly. "You sent me away because you thought distance meant control. What you gave me was access." The line went quiet again. When he spoke, his voice was smaller. "What do you want?" he asked. The question landed differently than it once would have. Power had shifted. He felt it, even without seeing me. "I want time," I said, "and silence." "For what?" "To decide what you're worth to me now." I hung up before he could respond. That night, lying in a room that felt almost comfortable, I stared at the ceiling and felt no triumph, no anger, just certainty. The girl he'd slapped into compliance no longer existed. The woman he'd created by trying to erase her was standing exactly where she needed to be. And the phone would keep ringing. When I was ready to answer, the rules would be mine. Time did what it always did when I stopped chasing it. It stretched. Days passed without another call. That told me more than any apology ever could. He wasn't panicking yet. He was recalculating. Men like him always believed there was a formula they could rework if they just adjusted the inputs. I let him believe that. I focused instead on tightening my position. The transfer had placed me closer to decision-makers, people who didn't touch the work directly, but shaped it with spreadsheets and signatures. I learned their habits quickly. Who liked to feel clever, who needed reassurance, who panicked at the mention of audits, and who treated them like theater. I became useful without becoming visible. When people asked how I understood things so quickly, I said, I paid attention. When they praised my work, I deflected. When they complained, I listened. Silence, I'd learned, invited confession. Information kept coming. Not dramatically, casually. A comment here, a frustration there. I began to see how my stepfather's business sat inside a larger ecosystem of intermediaries, consultants, and shell arrangements. He wasn't important. He was replaceable. That was the most dangerous thing for him to realize. I began drafting options in my head, not plans yet, scenarios. If I exposed him publicly, the fallout would be loud but short. He'd blame partners, claim misunderstanding. He might even survive it bruised but intact. If I went legal immediately, the process would grind forward slowly, consuming time and energy I had only just regained. Justice, when rushed, often served the wrong people. The third option was quieter, more surgical, and far more final. I waited for confirmation before committing. It arrived in the form of an email forwarded to me by someone who didn't realize what it meant. A routine request, due diligence, a list of names attached to a potential restructuring. My stepfather's name was there flagged with a note that read, "Risk exposure." I closed my eyes and breathed. That was the opening. I reached out to him again 2 days later. Not by phone, by email. Brief, neutral, professional. "We should talk. There are things you don't understand about your situation," he replied within minutes. "Name a time." We agreed on a call that evening. He sounded different when he answered. Tired, careful. The certainty that had once filled his voice was gone, replaced by something like caution. "You've been busy," he said. "So have you." He tried to steer the conversation toward reconciliation, spoke about stress, about how things had spiraled, about how he'd only wanted to protect the family, protect the business. I let him finish. Then I told him what I knew. Not everything, just enough. The partnerships that weren't real, the liabilities hidden in fine print, the way his name was circulating now, not as an asset but as a complication. His breathing changed, sharper, faster. "You're bluffing," he said weakly. "I'm not," I replied, "but you're welcome to find out the hard way." Silence stretched between us again. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "What do you want?" The question was familiar now. It no longer felt powerful coming from him. "I want control," I said, "of what happens next." He tried to negotiate immediately, offered money, apologies, promises, the usual currency of men who believed consequences could be settled like invoices. I cut him off. "You don't get to buy your way out of this," I said calmly. "You don't get forgiveness on demand. You get terms." He agreed too quickly. Desperation makes people sloppy. I laid them out slowly. First, he would unwind every financial decision he'd made in my name, not quietly, transparently. Correcting records, filing affidavits, leaving a trail that could be followed if necessary. Second, he would step back from the parts of his business that intersected with international operations. Not temporarily, permanently. I named the clauses, the deadlines, the consequences. Third, he would say nothing about me, to anyone. No explanations, no justifications, no attempts to reclaim narrative. He listened. He didn't interrupt. And finally I added, "You will accept that whatever relationship we have going forward will be on my terms, not yours." He swallowed audibly. "You're enjoying this?" I considered the question honestly before answering. "No," I said. "I'm finished being afraid of you." That was when he broke. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a quiet collapse of posture I could hear through the phone. The man who had once believed he could erase me with a signature sounded suddenly small. "I never meant for it to go that far," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's what makes it worse." We ended the call with agreements in place and paperwork already moving. He didn't thank me. He didn't threaten me. He simply complied. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time afterward, waiting for something to rise in me. Satisfaction, relief, anger. What I felt instead was distance. The power I held now wasn't intoxicating. It was sobering. It demanded restraint, not indulgence. Over the next weeks, I watched the effects ripple outward. Deals paused. Names disappeared from emails. Consultants stopped calling. His world shrank quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. No one would ever know my role in it. That was the point. One night as I walked back to my room under a sky heavy with clouds, I realized something that surprised me. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have required him to suffer in a way that satisfied me emotionally. This required something else entirely. Finality. I had removed his ability to harm me again, removed his leverage, removed the version of himself that believed he could discard people without consequence. The silence that followed was complete, and for the first time since the night his hand connected with my face, I slept without dreaming of him at all. The silence afterward was louder than anything that had come before. No calls, no emails, no intermediaries trying to renegotiate what had already been decided. The absence felt deliberate, respectful in a way that surprised me. He had understood the boundaries. Or perhaps he had finally understood me. I didn't celebrate. I didn't mark the moment. Power that needs ceremony is already leaking. Instead, life kept moving, and I let it. The facility began to feel smaller, less oppressive, as if the walls themselves had relaxed once the tension left my body. I still worked, I still listened, but the work no longer defined me. It was something I did not, something that contained me. People treated me differently now, though no one could have explained why. Authority doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply settles into your posture the way you stand when you no longer expect to be pushed. Alina noticed first. She sat beside me one evening and studied my face with that same calculating calm she'd used when I first arrived. Then she nodded once. "You're done," she said. Yes. She didn't ask with what. She didn't need to. "I won't say goodbye," she continued. "That makes it sentimental. I wouldn't expect you to." She smiled faintly. "Good." Word traveled quickly after that, the way it always does in places built on proximity and routine. I was leaving, not disappearing, not reassigned quietly in the night, leaving on paper with permission with documents that acknowledged my existence instead of erasing it. The day I received them, I held them carefully, not out of fear they'd vanish, but out of respect for what they represented. Identity restored, agency recognized. I packed slowly. I had learned not to rush endings. The women I lived with watched me without envy. Survival here had taught them that comparisons were pointless. Each exit came with its own cost, its own aftermath. One of them pressed a small object into my hand before I left. A scrap of fabric, a charm, something personal carried for years. For memory, she said. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The journey out felt unreal in its ease. Doors opened, stamps landed where they were supposed to. Officials addressed me directly, asked questions that assumed I would answer for myself. It took effort not to flinch at that. At the airport, I paused longer than necessary watching people hurry past, with lives intact, problems still abstract. I wondered how many of them believed the world was orderly because it had never bothered to test them. I no longer shared that belief. I didn't go home right away. I stayed elsewhere first, somewhere neutral, somewhere that let me breathe without pulling me backward into old roles. I let my body adjust, let my mind slow down enough to hear its own thoughts again. That was when the messages started. Not from him, from others, people I hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, contacts who had gone quiet when my life unraveled. They reached out cautiously, as if unsure whether I still existed in the same form. I answered selectively. The story I told was simple. I had been away. I had learned things. I was available now. That was enough. Opportunities followed, not dramatic ones, practical ones. Work that valued my understanding of systems and people. Roles that required discretion, patience, and the ability to see what others missed. I accepted one, then another. I built something quietly brick by brick without announcing it. A life that didn't rely on approval or proximity to power. One that didn't require me to be smaller so others could feel larger. Months passed. When I finally saw my mother again, she cried the way people do when relief and regret collide. She apologized without being asked. She listened without defending him. She told me things I didn't need to hear, but appreciated anyway. He wasn't there. That was intentional, on both our parts. I didn't ask about him. I didn't need updates. His presence in my life had been reduced to what it should have been all along, irrelevant. Later, when we did occupy the same room for the first time, it was unremarkable. Two adults sharing space without pretending history hadn't happened, without trying to rewrite it either. He looked older, not broken, just altered. He didn't speak much. He didn't try to reclaim authority. When he addressed me, it was with caution, as if he understood that familiarity was no longer his to claim. That was enough. The true aftermath revealed itself in subtler ways. I noticed how quickly I identified manipulation now, how easily I stepped back when conversations turned transactional, how naturally I withheld parts of myself that didn't need to be shared. I trusted fewer people, but I trusted myself completely. One afternoon, long after the dust had settled, I realized something that stopped me mid-step. I wasn't angry anymore, not because the harm hadn't mattered, not because it hadn't shaped me, but because anger had done its work and stepped aside. What remained was clarity. He had tried to remove me from his world because he believed I existed only within it. He had never considered that I might grow beyond his reach, beyond his imagination. He had never considered that survival could turn into strategy. I carried the lesson forward not as bitterness, but as structure. I taught myself never to confuse access with intimacy, never to assume authority was permanent, never to underestimate what people become when they are forced to rebuild from nothing. The woman who had boarded that plane months earlier would not have recognized me now. She had believed safety came from proximity to power. She had believed endurance was enough. She had been wrong. Endurance is the entry fee. Understanding is the reward. On quiet nights when I allow myself reflection, I don't think about revenge. I think about transformation, about the way systems reveal themselves under pressure, about how exile can sharpen instead of erase. I think about how silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is sovereignty, and I know with a steadiness that no one can take from me now that whatever comes next will meet a version of me that cannot be relocated without consent. Not ever again. The last thing that changed was not my address, my job, or the people around me. It was my posture. I noticed it one morning while standing in line for coffee. The place was crowded, noisy, ordinary in a way that once would have comforted me. Someone behind me bumped my shoulder and muttered an apology that wasn't really one. Months ago, I would have shifted forward, made myself smaller, absorbed it without thought. This time, I didn't move. I didn't glare. I didn't react. I simply stayed where I was, solid and unmoved. The person behind me adjusted instead. It sounds insignificant. It wasn't. That was when I understood the journey was actually over. Not because the story had wrapped itself neatly, not because everyone got what they deserved, but because I no longer felt the reflex to yield space that belonged to me. Life settled into something quieter after that. Not easy, honest. I built my routines carefully. Morning walks, work that required my mind more than my compliance, evenings where silence felt chosen, not imposed. I kept my circle small. Not out of fear, but out of respect for what it took to earn closeness now. People sometimes asked where I'd been, why I seemed different, why I paused before answering questions that used to roll off my tongue. I told them the truth, just not all of it. I said I'd been away, that I'd learned things the hard way, that distance changes you if you survive it. They nodded, thinking they understood. They didn't, and that was fine. My stepfather faded into the background of my life the way a storm fades once it passes. You don't forget it happened. You just stop checking the sky every 5 minutes. He kept his distance. He honored the boundaries because he had learned finally what it cost not to. We existed in the same world now, not the same story. My mother watched me with a mixture of pride and sadness. She apologized once more quietly without asking for absolution. I accepted the apology without promising anything beyond what I could give. Peace does not require reconciliation. Sometimes it only requires clarity. I thought often about the women I'd left behind, about Alina, about the quiet intelligence that had shaped me more than any lecture or threat ever could, about the ones whose names I would never know, whose strength would never be documented. I carried them with me not as ghosts, but as proof. Proof that power does not always wear a uniform. Proof that endurance becomes dangerous when paired with understanding. On certain nights when the world felt too clean, too safe, I remembered the sound of that bell before dawn, the way cold air burned the lungs, the way silence functioned as a language. Those memories no longer hurt. They calibrated me. I stopped believing that justice always looked like punishment. Sometimes it looked like containment. Sometimes it looked like a door that would never open again for someone who had once walked through every door without consequence. The most surprising part, even to me, was that I didn't miss the anger. Anger had been fuel, necessary, temporary. It had carried me through the worst of it, but it was never meant to be a destination. Letting it go didn't make me weak. It made me precise. The world did not suddenly become fair. People did not suddenly become good. Systems did not magically correct themselves. But I became someone who could see the fault lines clearly and choose where to stand. That was enough. One evening, long after the dust had settled, I received a message from someone I didn't recognize. A woman. She said she'd heard about me through a mutual contact. She said she was in a situation that felt wrong, that paperwork was being used to corner her, that everyone kept telling her to be patient. She asked if I had advice. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Then I typed back something simple. Do not rush. Do not panic. Learn who benefits from your silence. She replied almost immediately. Thank you, she wrote. I thought I was overreacting. You're not, I wrote back. You're just early. I put the phone down and sat there letting that settle. This is how cycles break. Not with explosions, with information, with timing, with people refusing to disappear quietly. If there is one thing I carried out of that place with me, it's this. No one gets to decide your ending because they controlled a chapter. No one gets to erase you because they had access to a system you didn't yet understand. And if someone ever tells you that exile is the same thing as defeat, remember this. Some people are sent away so they can be reduced. Others are sent away so they can be rebuilt without interference. If you're still here with me, thank you for listening to this story all the way through. I read every comment, and I want to know what part of this journey stayed with you the most. Was it the silence, the waiting, or the moment you realized power had shifted? If stories about quiet revenge, family betrayal, and finding strength where none was supposed to exist resonate with you, make sure you stay close. There are more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss them. Take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes the most final revenge is simply becoming untouchable.